Nice to see you, sir. We always seem to have you when there is bad news, but we appreciate you being here nonetheless.
My pleasure.
If you think about this attack, it certainly tells you that there are still very bad people who want to hurt people in the West. We don't have a claim of responsibility. We don't know who, but all the hallmarks point one way. That said, look at what it isn't, though. It wasn't Madrid. It wasn't 7/7. It wasn't Brussels. It wasn't the Bataclan. Can we learn anything from the terrorists, especially in the UK, seem to be getting worse and worse at this, and their attacks seem to be less and less sophisticated?
Well, certainly that's been the case with the vehicular attacks and the knife attacks. Those are among the most basic. What troubles me here is this was an attempt at a mass casualty attack. In other words, had this been successful, we would have seen perhaps several dozen people killed or severely injured. It was extremely lucky that this failed to detonate.
The president on Twitter called the bomber or the terrorists, as he said, losers. And we're watching some video sort of looking into the London Underground where the device was sitting after people evacuated. The president called these people, this bomber, losers. The fact that it was not that sophisticated of a device, it was basically a construction bucket with some wires and tried to wire to explode, and instead it just sort of had a loud, big flash to it. Anything to learn from that this wasn't something like a 7/7 attack where there were really well-made bombs, or the Ariana Grande concert where there were really sophisticated bombs that had been made?
Well, I think actually you're touching on the right point here. The fact that this did not detonate fully will give investigators a real opportunity. They'll be able to look for fingerprints. They'll be able to look for other markings that might be able to determine where the items were purchased for the bomb. In other words, there's a lot more forensics that can be conducted here. And the other thing is, let's try to figure out exactly where this was posted. If in fact this was inspired by someone on the internet, let's find out where the instructions for this bomb came from, and we can from there work backward to figure out who's been on those sites and how we can perhaps get to the network, or perhaps just lone wolf that was responsible for this attack.
And that brings up this next issue. Inspire magazine, which is Al-Qaeda's magazine, according to some reporting from our Catherine Herridge in Washington, has been posting about trying to go after train cars, train carriages. And if you think about it, you think about the 7/7 attacks in London, you think about Madrid, you think about some of the attacks in Brussels. Those have all been pretty successful. Are we seeing a move perhaps back to that? It focused on public transportation rather than, say, airliners?
Look, I think it's very possible, and obviously Inspire magazine has been, unfortunately, an inspiration for jihadists for years. I think the real question right now is if this was in fact Al-Qaeda, does this signal a resurgence of this terrorist group? A lot of people have been obviously focused on ISIS for the last several years, and I think have ignored the threat from Al-Qaeda, despite the fact that it controls more territory and is arguably stronger than it's been in many years. So if we're seeing this shift, it is obviously very troubling.
When we're talking about these different groups, you know, ISIS, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, Boko Haram, when you're talking about sort of all these disparate groups, at some point, if I'm a jihadi in London and I want to be radicalized, does it really matter which group? Or is it sort of this amorphous blob of radical Islam, and whether I listen to that cleric or this cleric, I'm going to still want to go commit a terrorist attack?
Well, you know, the process of radicalization, as they call it, takes many different forms. It can be through local preachers. What you're talking about is the affiliate groups of Al-Qaeda, and these are groups that have local grievances as well as international objectives. And so depending on if you're looking at an immigrant, for example, and they come from Somalia, well, then that might pull them in the direction of some of those East Africa terror groups that you mentioned, or if they're of Yemeni extraction or Saudi extraction, they might be looking at AQAP. But at the end of the day, you are talking. Yeah.
Real quickly, I want to get to this before we have to go. When it comes to the issue of radicalization, have the Brits begun to crack down after these past two attacks, especially the Ariana Grande suicide bombing, on those community hate preachers that we've heard so much about?
My understanding is that there has been a lot of work done and that they've been increasing their activity. But obviously, this is a country that is now really under attack and it's under siege. The numbers, I think, are overwhelming for Scotland Yard and MI5.
Yeah, well, it's now coming up on just about 6 o'clock there in the United Kingdom. Rush hour on a Friday night. We hear that there are counterterrorism police all over the London Underground, the Tube, as well as the rail stations, hoping that there is not another attack as they continue to track this suspect that they have on CCTV cameras. Jonathan, we really appreciate your insight, sir. Thank you.
Anytime.
All the best. Julie?